We share here our joys and concerns as part of recognizing that all these parts of us are important and real. And resilience clearly plays a role in how we're all able to handle the challenges in our lives. So I really want to know how resilience works for myself and for others. Today's talk basically comes out of my own trying to work this through and my current understanding of how resilience actually works. So resilience at its core is about how we as human beings respond to stress. One scientific study noted, quote, the fact that most people, when exposed even to extraordinary levels of stress and trauma, manage to maintain normal psychological and physical functioning and avoid serious mental illness, unquote. So that we have to start with that extraordinary levels of stress and trauma place to think about what is resilience and why some people are better able to handle that than others. And spoiler alert, it's not a character. Trauma is just another word for the experience of extraordinary stress over a long period of time. Stress and trauma are on the same continuum, with trauma at the more extreme edge. What is it in us that can often, but not always, adapt to physical, emotional, social, and biological stress without long-term impairment of our ability to function? You know, like in Audre Lorde's poem, it's almost as if a lot of people with the challenges in their lives are not meant to survive, and yet so many do. That's one of the ways to look at resilience, is what is it that allows us, even with that level of trauma, sometimes people are able to survive, find a way to go on, even try and make things better for another generation. Resilience as a word is actually a metaphor. The word at its core is about the property of elasticity and being able to bounce back. But the reality is that we really don't bounce back after stress and trauma to exactly where we were. Resilience is about keeping or restoring our physical and psychological well-being, but there's always some trace of that trauma and stress. And when there's extreme stress, it can produce PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or MDD, major depressive disorder. Now, MDD, I want to make clear, that kind of depression is not the same as some kinds of depression like bipolar disorder, which can be impacted by stress but are not originally triggered by them, really. MDD is an extreme form of situational depression, beyond what is considered the normal time period for the single episode depression that most of us do go through in times of loss and stress. I'm talking today mainly about how we understand resilience and stress, and how do we prepare for stress and trauma so that we are able to be more resilient. I want to stress here that if you are currently experiencing acute versions of the effects of stress, you really need to see a mental health professional. I'm not talking today about that level of stress in our lives. And it's not my place or expertise to deal with that other than helping you find someone to deal with it who has that level of expertise. When you're already in the quagmire, getting that professional help is essential to interrupt the cycle and develop coping strategies. But most of us are not in that stage. The level of stress and trauma is certainly one of the factors in how resilient we are. You know, there are diseases and accidents that are such stress in the human body that we cannot survive. Some losses impact us more than others do. Some physical trauma is beyond our level for coping, and that's just human reality. We are not super beings. I think of this in my own life. It's almost 10 years ago now that I faced the biggest physical trauma of my life, which was major surgery. The medical people at the time were convinced, and I could see it in their eyes when I talked to them, that I had advanced gallbladder cancer. And spoiler alert, I didn't have cancer. But they thought I did, and so they were prepared to handle that. And as I was about to go into the operating room, I didn't know that. The symptoms I had been so severe that I had not been able to eat almost anything for 3 weeks. And I had lost more than 30 pounds in that time, which also weakened me physically. And because our brains are part of our physical bodies, weakening my body meant weakening my emotional and mental state as well. And then the anesthesiologist met me before I was going to go into the operating room, and he explained to me what was about to happen. And I remember very clearly one thing he said. The surgery you're going into will be the physical equivalent of being hit by a truck. Well, we don't all survive being hit by a truck or major medical crises like cancer. Recovery for me, even without the complication of cancer, was slow. And I brought to that crisis everything I had learned to that date about trauma and resilience. 6 months later, I was able to run a quarter mile at a time. Now that may not sound like much to many of you. Just a quarter mile? Well, the context of this is that as a young person, I was not able to muster the breath to run very far. In gym class, I was usually the last person to finish when we did running. A quarter mile when I was 16 was not possible in one run. I had to stop and rest and catch my breath. And when I was 16, I was a lot lighter and thinner than I have been as an adult. I had to stop often and catch my breath. I never ran a quarter mile at a time until after that major surgery, decades later. So my interest in resilience and trauma has often been personal too. But my mind is also very curious. I want to know not just what practically has shown to work, but why does it work? So here are some of the things I've learned more recently about the science of resilience. The basics first of fear. As animals, and we are animals, we are evolved to have brains that moderate how we process perceived threats. Our limbic system, which is shared with other animals from reptiles on in the evolutionary chain, that limbic system automatically and instinctively responds to perceived threats, and not in very sophisticated ways. That automatic and quick response of the limbic system allows us to move quickly to avoid or confront danger, fight and flight mainly. As mammals, though, we have a neocortex in our brain as well, which lizards don't. And some of the chemicals of our neocortex, which is where our higher level thinking functions are able to allow the neocortex to calm that limbic system down to move outside of fight and flight as our only reactions. So one of the things that is becoming more clear, and I've looked at a number of these studies, is that there are some genetic variables that influence how resilient we are. Some people are just born more resilient than others, or with the potential to be more resilient than others. Some of our genes influence the level of those chemicals that our brain is able to produce, both the chemicals that the limbic system produces to turn off the neocortex, and the chemicals that the neocortex produces to turn down the limbic system. They kind of fight sometimes. These genes may have been adaptive over long periods of inheritance in certain parts of the world and certain ways people lived. But very few of the things that we've genetically developed are likely to be that effective in the world we live in today, which is different than it was 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The other factor that really does matter in resilience is life experience. As my story of my operation reminds me, some experiences of stress are just harder to handle and some are easier to handle. Science shows us that those who've experienced long histories of trauma, which can include childhood abuse, it can include the social abuse of generations of oppression. People who have experienced those long histories of trauma have brains that have adapted to trauma, with trauma and stress triggering how that genetic heritage then gets played out. For example, one of the chemicals involved in our brains, you've probably heard of, is serotonin. It's a neurotransmitter. That means that it's used by different parts of the brain to suppress or activate other parts of the brain. And serotonin is a chemical that is connected to feelings of happiness and reward, and to better learning and memory. You know, it's interesting that when we are stressed, if we're handling it well, we have lots of serotonin in our brains, which also allows us to learn from the stressful experience. Higher levels of serotonin are connected with the ability to explore new environments. When we are under stress, especially to the level of trauma, we have less serotonin produced in our brains. That can also be linked, the lower levels of serotonin, to feelings of depression. Genes influence how easily each of us produces serotonin, and experience influences how our genes get activated. The same chemicals can influence us to what are called maladaptive behaviors. Addiction is one of the common ways that people self-medicate in stress. It has a short-term positive effect and a long-term negative effect. But for instance, why do people eat a lot when they're under stress? Anybody here a stress eater? A lot of people are stress eaters. You know, serotonin, the happiness chemical, in other animals, including reptiles, serotonin signals that food is available. When serotonin is suppressed under stress or trauma, our brains think we have to stock up on calories since food is scarce. You know, our neocortex knows better, but our serotonin levels tell us eat when you find food, and eat all you can because there's not much in this environment. It's not conscious, and in fact, if we think about it consciously, we know it's ridiculous. You know, look at how much food is in that pantry. But when our serotonin levels are lower, our brains are signaling us, eat everything you can, because you might starve tomorrow. So, if experience and genetics combine to influence how we react, are we just stuck with what happens to us and what we're given? And no, the answer is no, because as mammals, and especially as human mammals, we have this marvelous neocortex which can think about situations and plan ahead and drive us to other behaviors and learning habits which can help override some of our instincts. You know, after my operation 10 years ago, I didn't just start running by accident. I had to choose to do so under guidance of someone with expertise in physical training who knew it was going to be helpful to me. My original goal in doing the physical training was to rebuild my core muscles, which had been sliced in half by the operation. But I wanted to rebuild my strength, and I made some choices to do that. I wanted to bounce back, and in fact, in some ways, physically, I ended up better than I was before. It was a conscious decision informed by knowledge. And that conscious decision-making is essential in emotional resilience as well. But it doesn't tend to work real well when you're under stress. It works better before you are in the stress. Whether we have a genetic tendency to handle stress and trauma better or worse, we can make some conscious choices about how we're going to prepare to handle whatever happens to us in the future. And if we have children, we can work to strengthen them so that they're better able to handle stress. We may have experienced trauma, long-term severe stress, whether our experience of childhood abuse or wartime trauma or the trauma of poverty and racism and sexism, or violence in our lives and communities. And that level of experience will influence somewhat how hard or easy it is to build resilience. But there are ways to build that resilience. Some of the science we are learning says that occasionally, when our mental state is seriously affected so that it is hard to cope, and thus even to think about building our strength and resilience, we may need some assistance, some supplement to brain chemistry. Though I personally have had a long skepticism about putting any kind of drugs in my system, because I know that drugs, it's not that they have side effects, they have effects. And some of them are positive and some are negative. But I've witnessed the amazing changes in people who have, in times of serious crisis after stress, used some of the drugs that shift brain chemistry. They can suppress the whirlpool of fear and anxiety and get a person back closer to the equilibrium where they can then use their common sense and their knowledge to manage better and to avoid getting back into that whirlpool. Therapy with an expert can also help break through when one is already in the throes of depression or anxiety and reactivity. But that's the more extreme case. Most of us aren't in the whirlpool right now. And again, if you are, I repeat, get professional help, please. So how do we prepare when we are in better times? The neurobiological perspective is this. How do we create experiences to strengthen those parts of our nervous system that can calm us in times of threat, enough to engage our problem-solving skills and not just react, when immediate reaction is not the best way to handle the stress? It's like exercise for the brain, and we know something about that. One of the fields in which there's been a lot of research has been around mindfulness as a form of exercise for the brain. Mindfulness as a practice helps us learn to calm our reactivity, a learning that provably carries over into times of stress. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who has worked with mindfulness-based stress reduction in medical settings for many years, describes mindfulness this way, that it's awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. Awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. In times of stress, we want to be able to take our attention and focus it on purpose. Mindfulness practices help us to build that skill and actually a physical ability, because our brains are physical. To assess the reality of the stress and to muster our problem-solving skills, we need to be able to focus our attention where we want it focused. Paying attention in the present moment, non-judgmentally. Some of the exercises that you did were mindfulness. Mindfulness is not just meditation. It's any time we pay attention in the present moment, non-judgmentally and on purpose. Research has shown that various mindfulness practices, including meditation, have an effect on at least 5 of the neurochemicals that are connected with how we handle stress. Mindfulness, as I said, doesn't have to be formal meditation, but any practices that build our ability to pay attention in the present moment. So looking at mindfulness effects can walk us through some of the chemicals of resilience and stress. The first I already mentioned, serotonin. That's that happiness chemical, and it reduces our chance of depression. One of the things I think of with depression is I've worked with it in a pastoral counseling sense, is that depression is kind of it's a condition which limits your ability to make choices. It's hard when you're in depression to make a choice. Serotonin is suppressed when we are stressed, and increasing serotonin can help manage stress. Adequate serotonin also helps us repair damage in our body. So it's not just our mood, it's actual physical repair. Decreased serotonin can mean slower healing physically, and increased serotonin can mean improved healing. And mindfulness practices measurably increase serotonin. When I asked you to find something beautiful and focus on it, that was a way of helping you get your serotonin level up for a minute. And then there are endorphins. Those are the chemicals in our brains that impact our mood, which impacts our resilience, our ability to handle our experience. Mindfulness practices can increase the endorphins that make us feel good. And then there's one that has a long chemical name, which isn't important, but the short name is GABA. I love the name GABA, G-A-B-A. That's the main thing that our brains use as a chemical to calm our limbic system when we're afraid. Low levels of GABA can increase our anxiety and nervousness, making it less likely we'll respond appropriately to what is causing our stress. One of the main anti-anxiety drugs that I've seen people use that helps get them their equilibrium back is basically a drug that increases GABA in your brain. When you're able to calm the limbic system, and that's the system again that processes threats, we're able to handle stress more effectively. Mindfulness practices measurably increase our ability to produce GABA. And our neocortex is virtually bathing our limbic system in GABA at that point. That's why mindfulness meditation feels so calming. And then there's another chemical which works the opposite way in stress, which is cortisol. Cortisol is a chemical that's released in our bodies when we are stressed. Cortisol has a positive effect when there is danger, which it helps us to move our muscles quickly, fight or flight. It also turns off our problem solving somewhat, so that we are not sitting there analyzing, but we are moving. Cortisol, though, is supposed to dissipate quickly in our bodies. But if it stays in our bodies for a long time with constant threat, like military personnel in war zones have, or if we are subject to childhood abuse, too much cortisol for too long can actually change our brain, causes brain damage essentially. It can increase the level of heart disease, and it has other heart health effects. One of the effects of too much cortisol for too long is it makes it more difficult for us to create memories accurately, which is partly why in PTSD, the memories of, for instance, a loud noise are not stored in a way that has time and place with it. And so even a car backfiring can trigger that memory. Mindfulness practice measurably reduces cortisol levels over time. Another abbreviation, DHEA, that's a hormone that if it's in adequate balance in our brains, helps to manage cortisol. We need DHEA to dissipate that cortisol. Research into PTSD shows a real connection between DHEA and cortisol balance. A higher DHEA release during stress mediates the stress level that PTSD has, which is why DHEA is sometimes considered a resilience factor. There are some mixed studies on DHEA because it has some negative effects too, but it seems like balancing DHEA and cortisol is the key factor. And meditation, again measurably, helps get DHEA and cortisol into balance. And we'll add, the more that you currently have issues with anxiety and fearfulness, the more difficult it might be to learn to practice mindfulness. So begin small. Even just deliberately focusing your attention on different objects for a few seconds is a way to begin training your brain to be more resilient. Beyond mindfulness practices, another thing that can build resilience immeasurably is having meaningful relationships. Not just a romantic relationship, but friendship. People who belong to religious groups, like churches, show measurably more ability to have resilience. It's probably not the belief system, but the fact that you're an interactive member of a community and you get human relationships. Serotonin, endorphins, GABA, and DHEA are all stimulated by having good relationships. Cortisol is reduced if our social relationships are good. And we just lost my talk here. Okay, we're going to see if this comes back. So meaningful relationships are clearly one of the keys to having, to building our resilience. I'm going to get my handout that's somewhere here and work from that because I'm not sure my computer's coming back. It isn't very resilient. So one of the things I was already planning to do was go back over the 10 factors I talked about 4 years ago that help build resilience in children, because they also are the things that help build resilience in adults. And so I just want to review those 10 quickly. And again, there's a handout of them. The first one is to recognize that adversity is part of life. Think of that poem by Audre Lorde where she talked about recognizing that she wasn't meant to survive is part of what helps her survive, as long as she speaks it. You know, when I do weddings for people, we don't say you're going to live happily ever after. Vows say for better or for worse. Because a good resilient marriage begins with acknowledgement that it's not all going to be happily ever after. So acknowledging and not denying that there are problems is one of the ways that we reduce stress and increase our resilience. Being adaptable and adaptive is important. We need to have flexibility and be able to see change as an opportunity for growth. We need to have the mental flexibility to think of new solutions. Emotional competence is another area that we need to build in advance of our traumas, if we can. And that means being, among other things, just being able to name emotion. Being able to name an emotion calms your brain. Having a level of optimism and nurturing your optimism is important. And that doesn't mean the kind of optimism that says everything will work. It's the kind of optimism that says there's a possibility it could work, and now what do I do to get there? Another one, which I've already mentioned, but I want to emphasize, is connection with other people. We need connections outside of ourselves and our family, and our children need those. Connections help build a sense of security, which help us become calmer when we face adversity. It also just helps us to have people who can help when we're in bad situations. Looking to uniqueness rather than sameness, it turns out, is one of the ways to build resilience. Not expecting that just because you handle resilience this way, everyone else has to handle it that way. Different people have different adaptations for that. Competence and ease in communication is important, and particularly being able to communicate needs and feelings. Communicating our needs and feelings is a way to build our resilience, as well as to help others understand what we need and maybe help us get what we need. The eighth one is connection to a larger meaning and purpose. This is, we're social animals, we need connection with people, but a sense that there is a larger purpose that we are connected with is really important. What they find is with different religions, the religions that say there's one path and purpose actually do less well than religions that say, you have some work to do figuring out what your purpose is. Because it's the act of finding the purpose and nurturing that that actually helps us more than having a prescription. The ninth one is being able to see the positive in a situation. And that doesn't mean when we lose someone we love, for instance, that we say that was a good thing. It means we figure out how we're going to make something of it. I think here of the two mothers who started the Mothers Against Drunk Driving crusade, who looked at the terrible loss in their families and said, we're going to do something with it. We've just passed the second anniversary of the Florida school shooting. And the kids who have dealt with that the best are the ones who said, I'm going to be an activist and work on trying to make change in the world. And finally, although flexibility and newness and being able to handle it is important, having some routines is also important. Having the same bedtime and wake-up time helps to build a sense of security in your brain so that you're able to handle stress better. Having life cycle ceremonies, having seasonal ceremonies, those are ways that we understand we have a place in this universe, and it gives a sense of security, not just to kids, but to adults. So I can't read you my closing words because my computer has abandoned me. But what I want to do is tell you that we're going to close this part with the song, The Rose. And part of the reason I chose this is that at a time when I was going through real emotional insecurity in my life and a level of trauma, I found this song. And that image of the rose beneath the winter snow was what I needed to develop the optimism in the sense of that there could be hope that kept me going through a really tough time. And this song has often served for people as a song to help deal with loss and grief.